Hello, my friends, Evolutionary Energy Arts family. Good to see you guys once again.
Hi, you guys. It's great to see you all again.
So this is going to be a fun one. We're going to get deep into, timelines and talk about the Annunaki, maybe talk a little bit about Yaldabaoth, talk about the Archons, perhaps, the demonic realm, including Wraiths and things like that. Lots of good topics. Who really is ruling this roost, and what is their agenda?
And we have Raven tonight, who's just a wealth of information, who's very knowledgeable, well-spoken on this, and that makes it even more exciting.
Raven, are you there?
About half.
Well, you are live now.
Well, and I have to tell everybody right up front, y'all, I actually wrote notes tonight to make sure that I get everything in chronological order for you.
That's awesome. Really curious about timelines, how things went down. Yeah, this is about as interesting a topic as you could get to.
It's really interesting that people put everything and they condense it down so tightly. My thing is some of the sources that we have are questionable. I love Zacharias Hitchens' work, but knowing where he comes from and what organizations that he comes from, you kind of have to very cautiously tread there.
Yeah, at the same time, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and a lot of people don't.
Absolutely.
A lot of people don't realize that there have been many, many people that have interpreted all the Sumerian writings. There's so many different people.
Yes, absolutely. Forster's another good one. Brian Forster?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I enjoy him.
But anyway, the timeline, a lot of people confuse the Annunaki with the Reptilians, with the Wraith or Archons. And a lot of the reason why it gets so confused is because when they talk about it in those short clips on television, they don't really give you a really good timeline as far as the distance between.
Yeah. Well, I definitely would be interested in hearing that.
Well, a lot of people. We'll start in the past, as far back as we can go. Esoteric writings talk about Lemuria, and discovered the bridge that went from India that they said was impossible to build. You can actually see it from Google satellites. That bridge was 400 miles long, I think, and it stretched out from southern India and connected to a big continent that has sunk in the Indian Ocean. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Lemuria dated, and I hate to use Helena Blavatsky, but that group with the Theosophical Society went and they traveled and they got a lot of information from places that other people hadn't. Lemuria is back as far as 40 million years. So that's our first one.
That's a long time ago, because I've heard most people I've heard talking about it have been in that 75,000 year timeline, but it's one of those things that's fascinating to look at.
It's a really, really difficult one. If you go by the geologists who say plate tectonics take millions and millions of eons, they say, a million. The Theosophical Society, after traveling to India, said 40 million years or thereabouts. When you start talking to other people who have done the research, they say somewhere around 75 to 100,000 years. So that is a big, big range. Part of the reason is because there's really no clear information on Lemuria.
Yeah, and the Lemurian people, from everything that we've heard, that was a more peaceful civilization than Atlantis.
Yes. Then we go through and, overlapping or after or before, you got the Anunnaki. And if you go by all the translations, we'll come in somewhere around 800 to 900,000 years ago when they arrived here. That is long before Atlantis. Long before the Reptilians, or the Archons, as some people want to call them. They arrived here, did their thing. We talked about the chromosome being spaced in humans, anyway. is evidence that the Sumerian tablets are not wrong.
Right.
And they were here. Some of them hated us, some of them loved us. We really threw them for a loop when they created whatever they created, and all of a sudden beings of light decided that this was a place to inhabit. It is very possible that they created the shells that they created hoping they would just have slaves, and they got surprised.
Yeah. So, I've heard that before as well, that the light beings, being trapped here in a loop.
Yeah, and Mu, a lot of people talk about Mu. I've seen all kinds of different things about Mu. Mu dates somewhere around Lemuria, so we don't know. And a lot of people think Mu, actually Lemuria itself. Not enough information. I've searched and searched and searched, and there's an old colonel who was a sailor that talked about it. There was a captain who talked about it. But the information's just not there to say anything specific. Which brings us to Atlantis. If you go to Plato says that Atlantis existed before the Egyptians, and the Egyptians that his family had spoken to said that it existed prior to the early age, which pre-existed Egypt. Everybody who talks about it says 12 to 25,000 years ago. Then when you start talking to other people, you get somewhere between 25 and 50,000 years ago. Now, that's a huge difference between the Annunaki being here, because they had already left 140,000 years ago, and Atlantis being created.
Yeah. Now, Atlantis, of course, we have all the legends of them kind of destroying themselves, or did they really, and did some go underground, some go into hiding?
Yeah, what happened with that?
Well, if you go to the Tablets of Thoth, and you go to some of the other rocks that have surfaced, it says, point blank, that the 9 elders in Atlantis opened the gate. And we talked about this the other night, so this might be a repeat for some folks, but they opened the gate. They were trying to cheat death. They were trying to get away without having to die. When they opened the gate, they apparently opened it the wrong way, and that is when the dark things, these Wraith, not the Archons as in Reptilians, but the Wraith, the shadows that you see flittering around and the things that whisper in people's ears, probably what would be quintessential demon, were turned loose. Except for this was just, they turned this entity loose, and it led to the destruction of Atlantis.
Wow, that's a lot of. They hold a lot of power. Then they're really nothing to mess with.
Well, my understanding is this thing manipulated. Opening the gate destroyed the city that the gate was in, and this thing manipulated those around it, and that's what started the War of the Men of Renown. This was long before Egypt. You can go back and you can look at, Michael will be able to help me with this, and go back and look at the text from India. They talk about the wars using Vimanas and fighting amongst the great men.
Yeah, most definitely. They talk of the wars of the Devas and the Asuras, and the Asuras are basically, we could equate them to, they're not really demonic, because they're not really like Wraiths. They're more like, they're more like us, but they have demonic tendencies. They're real beings, but their tendencies are very much, if you're talking about law of one, service to self as opposed to service to others. Where the Devas were all about teaching us and teaching us how to really have a good civilization, one that's not necessarily warlike, and one that's also just openly teaching us that Creator lies within. And everybody, has the divine spark within, whereas the Asuras, which, to me, it's pretty obvious, how they equate. They were all about control and power and worship me.
Well, and, here we go. It was turned loose in Atlantis. supposedly called all these malevolent things here. You know, how that worked in the midst of the war that the Annunaki were involved in, and so forth and so on, I really can't decipher. I know that the Anunnaki were at war with a reptilian race, it's in the description, and that they somehow pushed them here, and then Atlantis did its thing, and these Wraiths got loose. The order, I couldn't tell you if the Reptilians got here first or if the Wraiths got here first, and it's not clear. If you go to the Zulu, they say that the Reptilian people got here after the cataclysm, the Great Cataclysm, which if you start looking at the dates, that could have been 12,500 years ago, or it could have been 25,600 years ago. We've got records for both.
Yeah, it is definitely, there's a lot of conflicting data when it comes to dating stuff, most definitely, but it's fascinating when we start piecing everything from all around the world, you know, because then you get a bigger picture. If we're just looking at what comes from the powers that be, which have operated through our Western culture and our, you know, Abrahamic religions, then we're very, very limited in our ability to see the bigger picture.
Well, I was getting to that. You know, if you go from the time of Atlantis, you have to skip quite a ways before you even get to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were only 1500 BC. The Babylonians were 1700 BC. But if you go back, you got Egypt at 3100 or 5,000 years ago. You got the Akkadians just short of that, about 4,500 years ago. You got the Babylonians about 3,700 years ago. The Phoenicians were only 1,500 years ago. The Persians were only, I'm sorry, not 15, 35. But anyway, and then the Persians were only 500 years before BCE. So if you come down that line, they're all much later in the game.
Right, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And then you got Akhenaten Moses. Everybody calls him Moshe or Moses. You got Akhenaten, who came out of Egypt. And, you know, the Hebrews calendar right now, today, this date is 5780, 5,780 years. If you subtract that from the calendar, it takes you back 2331 BC, which would take you right about smack dab in the middle of the Egyptian times. They started their calendar at 3449. That's when they actually started using it. So that tells you that, you know, they were like 500 years before AD. They're not that old.
No, and many people don't realize, you know, that when you look at the biblical texts, and I was watching Anton Parks, I'm not sure if you watched him, but he's really good. And he was just saying on the fifth, what's it called? Yeah, the Fifth Kind channel. You know, he is somebody that could actually translate the Sumerian tablets, and he has. And when we're looking at the biblical texts, they're not old at all. They're not old at all compared to these, you know, Sumerian ones that are thousands of years older. And so, you know, the biblical texts are all pulled from the Egyptian and the Sumerian and other traditions, you know. So,
yeah, absolutely.
You know, and if you look at it, it's pretty clear. And
the interesting thing to me is that you've got Atlantis, and most people in the chat probably are familiar with the Eye of Africa. Now, the story about the Eye of Africa is that is where one of the cities of Atlantis was. You can see where the mountains above it were blown to pieces, and you can see where the sands were washed out into the Atlantic Ocean. You can see that from satellite. But Atlantis wasn't just a city. If you read the stories, Atlantis was a civilization. It had multiple cities. It wasn't just one.
Right.
The war that destroyed Atlantis was because they turned this Wraith loose. And there's a lot of stories. You know, most people know what the Lord of the Rings is. One ring to rule them all actually comes from some legends about Atlantis. they had the orichalcum rings, which was metal, and that one ring with the crystals in the middle of the city was used to rule everybody inside. Now, does that mind control? Oh, maybe. They're working toward that goal now.
Well, look at CERN. CERN, again, is an attempt to open dimensional portals, many people believe.
And that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about opening a gate. CERN popped into my mind.
Mm-hmm. Cycles. It's cycles. We talked the other night about, how many people in the chat room remember being here before. It might have been better, it might have been worse, but it really wasn't that much different. These Wraiths do not like us. We said it the other night. They do not understand our connection to the earth and the sky and the sun, and they don't understand the light that we carry. And honestly, I think they hate us for it. I don't know if they're capable even of that. I think they're pretty much just agnostic. They don't care one way or the other, but we make good food.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the eating the louche, and we had talked about that. I showed you that picture of what a friend of mine captured that I do feel looks like a wraith to me. I've seen these beings before, and Cindy has too.
Yeah, actually, you're right when you say they seemed indifferent. It seemed more curious.
Well, H.P. Lovecraft was very, very unique in the way that he wrote. And he always described these other beings as he gave them a physical shape, but he always talked about these elder beings as being dark and being indifferent. I'm pretty sure he was basing that on historical understanding of what, has been running around us all this time. We start talking about Archons. That would have been about the time that the Zulu and other people around the world talked about the Reptilians getting here. It's interesting that all of a sudden we have this weird merger between Baal Moloch, and the people who had fled out of Egypt.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. I was looking at that. Gosh, who were we watching, Cindy, that was talking all about Baal? Oh, that was R. Wayne Steiger was talking about him. And I have up on the computer right now Graham Hancock's Facebook. And so, getting into like the Gnostics, and Graham Hancock, has a little post here. The Gnostics were always persecuted by the followers of the Demiurge, nor has that persecution ceased. The most recent example is the genocide threatened by Islamists against the minority Yazidis in northern Iraq, which he brought up. And thank you, Susan Donahue, for the super chat. You're sweet, and we really appreciate your support. You've been so wonderful to us.
So much, Susan.
So as the Gnostics saw it, Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, is the demiurge or the chief of the Archons. That's the way, it was viewed.
Well, and we'll go. A lot of people like to point out that the Pope wears a fish suit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they use Saturn symbology.
Mm-hmm.
The cube in Mecca, and I'm sorry if I offend, the cube in Mecca is Saturn symbology. It's better to be realistic and truthful and have somebody angry than to sit and lie to somebody. All this symbology, I probably ought to mention the fact that right out in front of the Vatican is a Dyson sphere.
Yeah.
People don't look at that the way it is, but I find it funny that they throw all this Saturn symbology in our face. But at the same time, they don't worship Saturn. These people follow Baal Moloch, the bull. They put the gates of Baal all over every continent in the last 2 years. That tells you that what they are talking about is not the Anunnaki, and that's what we were really trying to get to, was separating the Wraiths from the Anunnaki, from the Reptilians, which are the Archons. Do I think some of the Reptilians are physical? Well, yes, because we've got stories about the Naga, we've got stories about other things not quite the same that are actually friendly. And then we've got the story about the reptilians themselves as humans and manipulate things from behind the scenes. Are they gods? No. But I do think they serve the demiurge that came out of the gate in Atlantis.
So you think it was the demiurge that came out of the gate in Atlantis?
Well, and the reason why I say that is because they like to mix languages and they like to tell you the truth and lie to you at the same time. You know, if you follow the path from Atlantis through Samaria, through Phoenicia, Babylon, Acadia, Persia, every one of them had a spirit that was leading them that was considered a shadow. Every one of those civilizations, including Israel, early Israel, got the same promise. If you serve me, I will make you my people. And as soon as this demiurge was done with them, what did he do? He threw them to the wolves.
Well, it also created a lot of war and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of loosh. And, you know, when you look at a lot of people that have really studied the Bible, come to the conclusion that there's two different gods there. There's, you know, the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And the Old Testament God's bloodthirsty, and then there's those that will use every excuse in the book to try to justify the murder, the rape, the looting, breaking almost every single commandment.
Yes.
You know, but then when Christ in the New Testament came, he's quoted with basically telling the religious authorities that they don't know his father, you know, they serve the other one. So,
Yes.
and that's the same thing that's going on right now in the world, and most people don't have a clue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, you have to think of these organizations. It's really hard to say this, but we all know about the behavior of the Catholic leadership.
Yeah.
They picked out billions of dollars for their bad behavior. But, you know, how many people know about all the bones found underneath the church in Scotland?
I think I vaguely heard something about that a while ago.
This is a long-going process, and you can go straight back to the statue of Baal Moloch with the flames sacrificing live children. And sex magic. Now, if you want to go back further than that, you have to go back to Babylon, and you have to go back to Samaria. So we can chase this one influence, this one race, this demiurge, all the way back to Thoth's tablets. Thoth is the one that gave it away, that this is where it came from. But it's the exact same behavior, the exact same manipulation all the way through. And then all of a sudden, we end up with all these other races, these lower ones, that are harassing everybody and feeding off of us. They're not connected to the Annunaki. If you read the story about battles to the men of the known, if anything, I would say that those were the Anunnaki trying to save us from what had got loose.
Well, there was divergent parties in the Anunnaki. We know from Enlil and Enki and their different opinions on, you know, how worthy is man of, you know, salvation, quote unquote, saving man from different disasters and things that were coming, as well as each other.
Well, you know, if you go back to the story of the Battle of the Giants, they said some were circumcised, and they were disgusting. And everybody thinks that they're talking about genitalia. But to be circumcised means that you give up yourself and let something else take over. And that's the old archaic term. A lot of people don't understand that language has changed and they have manipulated language. You can look at the dictionary from 1965 to today, and the same word will have two different meanings, sometimes completely reversed, like anarchy, for example. Anarchy used to mean self-rule, and it still does, but they say anarchy is chaos and disorder and everybody fending for themselves. And what it means is that everybody's taking care of themselves respectfully. That is a manipulation that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah, most definitely it has. You know, but we could see.
The reason why I point that out, the reason why I point that out is because circumcision does not mean having the foreskin cut off your member. It does today, But in the old archaic text, to be circumcised is to have your power removed, control of yourself removed.
I see.
So when you start looking at the War of the Giants and those that were circumcised and disgusting, they were referring to, they had given themselves over to these dark things. And their insides, their spirit, their light was disgusting. You know, you got to get back to the language of.
Right. So it's
what you ended up with is you ended up with Baal Moloch and Baal Mot, who had obviously been possessed. If you look at the story of Og, what did Og say? Og said, "I can't believe you served this thing." And he was speaking to the Jews, the Hebrews at the time, the followers of Abraham. And, you know, he knew that it had survived, obviously, because he knew they were going to come after him eventually.
Yeah, it's most definitely a very tangled web with a lot of different characters in play. And, you know, the Gnostics were just so persecuted, and so many others have as well when you look at it, on down through time. And there's always been just whatever justification they can do. You know, thou shalt suffer not a witch to live. You know, anybody that can access other dimensions, anybody that's intuitive, anybody that has psychic abilities, they're going to be persecuted.
Yeah, they don't want people around that can see through the charade,
exactly,
the facade that they put up. You know, they've gone after intuits ever since the Gnostics. But they've also gone after anybody who had any oral traditions that pre-existed that calamity. Because, you know, Native Americans and tribal people around the world saw them coming and knew what they were following. They knew what they were doing.
Well, you know, they had a different mindset and a different spirituality, you know,
yes,
so,
yes.
But, you know,
people talk about angels and demons and so forth and so on. How do you differentiate? It's very, very difficult. You've got something that's being benevolent, something that's being kind, something that's assisting you. But how many times have you heard stories about that benevolent thing all of a sudden turning really, really bad when somebody refuses to do something?
Well, maintaining a power control structure.
Mm-hmm. And then you hear of these innocuous things, you know, like we were talking the other night, how many people had an imaginary friend when they were kids? And that imaginary friend helped you learn, it helped you occupy time, never caused any harm to anything. It actually encouraged you not to cause any harm to anything. To me, that's the benevolent ones, but, you know, they say, oh, that's a ghost, or that's a spirit, or that's a demon in your house. We all know about interdimensionals. Usi, for example, or little people, or leprechauns, or gnomes, or whatever you want to call them, whatever part of the world you're from. You know, in the old days, these were good things. These were things that you wanted around you. They were interdimensional. And as long as you were doing what you were supposed to do, they didn't cause you any harm.
Well, as long as you respected life and respected the earth. And it's when we ask ourselves, you know, how can the powers that be, you know, have absolutely no care for the planet, for any of the life on it? Yeah, well, it makes sense to think that these people are controlled by these demonic, or what we call demonic entities.
Yes, you know, servants to the Archons. You know, whether or not they're actually reptilian, I don't know, they could be occupied. The story with the possession, you know, everybody likes that famous picture of George Bush Sr. with his eyes flashing, and other people that, you know, look like they have reptilian eyes. It could be the entity working through them from the other dimension. It wouldn't surprise me any. You know, stories of possession are everywhere. And we know that these reptilians are divided into two classes. The Archons that are physical and were present, and the ones that are still trapped on the other side, just outside of our vision, just outside of our reach.
And if we look at the Vedic tradition, not all of, and if you look into China too, not all of these reptilian type of beings are evil. You know, because there's the wise dragons, and then the Nagas were to be respected, but they weren't really thought of as evil. And if you look at Krishna, Vishnu, Vishnu is the preserver, actually rides on top of Seshanaga, which is like the leader of the Nagas, which is basically like a servant to him. It serves him. And then also we have the Kundalini, which is a reference to that energy that's inside all of us, which they don't want any of us activating, because we could just, we will have abilities more akin to the gods, just like the Garden of Eden.
Well, my thing is if we open those chakras and we get that energy flowing the way it should be, you can see the green auras around the trees. You can see the little lights flickering around you, and you know that they are alive. It's not just your eyes. You can see them shadows flit from place to place, even though the lights aren't moving. You can see through the veil, dimensional rift, to the things that are around you, and we know that we're surrounded. I mean, it's funny that the Christians and other religions say, "Oh, we got angels and demons around us all the time," but then when somebody actually talks about it, other than one of their leaders, then you're evil. I don't get this.
Yeah, it's just fear-based conditioning, and like we were talking about the Davic world, like the elementals. There are elemental beings that are in charge of keeping our bodies healthy. And, by separating us from that world, I always think about the lifespans that we had in the past. I think that's part of it, is separating us from the earth and separating us from the elemental realm, the Davic realm.
Well, and some people say, well, there can't be this entity that's driving all this. But let me point out that ever since Egypt, we have been moving in the same direction, and it's not a good direction. Money magic taking over the planet, basically, through the banking cartels, and it comes, out of Phoenicia and Samaria. And then we have this one religious political unity that is trying to drive everybody else down that won't support them. And they've been doing that constantly. They've been destroying history continuously ever since they've been ever since they were formed. And now we have this triune. We got the three horns. We've got the seven hills. We've got the Vatican at the seven hills. We've got the Bank of England. And I hate to say that out loud, but it's them. It's the Red Shields. We know this. And then we've got Washington, D.C., which is a corporation not even attached to the United States. That's the military arm. There's your three horns, if anybody's looking.
You can add Jerusalem to that. It's also on seven hills. So,
yeah, you do have that too, and those two are intimately connected, whether people like to think about it.
Yeah, most definitely. It's a power structure, a control structure, and it's easy enough to see by the actions that have gone on in the name of God, quote unquote. And
let's go back historically. These agencies, whether it be the education system that they've established in the last 150 years or so, or the religious system or the political system, these systems have insisted that we forget about the spirits that are around us. We forget about our connection to the earth. Everything that's vital for human survival in these bodies that we have, we insisted on doing it with, or creating such toxicity that we can't interact.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's been the whole plan. And controlling through frequencies, and Christy Belly brings up the Orion Wars, and there's been all sorts of this big struggle we're in. It's most definitely interdimensional, and it's also a galactic struggle. It's a very large struggle, and there was one lady, I'm trying to remember, I could see her face. I listened to like 20-30 hours of her lecturing, and she was basically saying that this entire galaxy is basically Dolores? Screwed up.
Dolores?
Not Dolores Cannon, and not Barbara Handclough. It's a different lady, but also, what's really fascinating, and I've been dying to dig it up. I just haven't gotten to it because we've been so busy with everything. But if you guys are familiar with the works of Barbara Marciniak, I think it was in her third book, she talks about exactly what's happening now. She said, we're going to need to get away from the technology because they're going to use the vibrations of the technology to do extremely horrible things to us.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that goes back to what the stories about Atlantis with their ring that can keep everything. You can't imagine that they built all their cities differently. But anyway, so here we are back around the same cycle again. They're trying to take everything over again. They're trying to control everybody again. And this has been going on, it seems like every 200 years this year lately. You and I were talking about this the other day. If you go back, you can go back 25,000 years, and then you can go back 12,500 years. And then all of a sudden it seems like every couple hundred years, and now it's almost every 100 years. 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900, and now we're 2020 again, and here comes the same thing. It's almost like the cycles have been sped up. I like to think it's because we have help coming from the inside, and we've got people from the older times that have come back. So people are waking up more quickly, so they have to reset it more quickly.
Yeah, that could very well be it, and it's like they get their momentum going, they get their people together, and it's a matter of us having to kind of stand up for ourselves, but what we need most of all is to understand what's going on. How can we protect ourselves if we're clueless as to the other realms, what these beings are, what they're about, what they want, what's the best thing for us to do, because a lot of us can see them, feel them. We don't exactly know what they're about, but we know that they're there.
Well, it goes back to meditation, become self-aware. Mm-hmm. And, you got to drop the blinders that have been pressed upon us for the last, 100 years. Just the education system alone drives as much out of you as it possibly can. And if you're unfortunate enough to be raised in an extremely religious family, then they, supplanted your given knowledge with their indoctrination. So you got a double dose. Mm-hmm. And most of us did get a double dose of some kind.
Yeah.
And not very many were lucky enough to find texts to wake up at a young age. It's really, really difficult to talk about. Back to Annunaki real quick. They never left. They said they were stuck here. They went back to their own planet. Mm-hmm. They also said that they came back to visit. And that's the reason why I brought up the Dyson sphere, sitting out in front of the Vatican, and a couple other places even. I actually voiced it once that these Wraith and the Reptilians had gotten such an upper hand here that the Annunaki retreated. It said so. They were in a war and they had to retreat. If the Wraith hit the upper hand and try to figure out a way out of this matrix that we're in, mm-hmm. And they get enough food to do it, that would not be good for anybody. And I had voiced my opinion, and it's just an opinion, but wouldn't it be the best answer to make sure that we were populating and overfeed these Wraith? It could be them resetting this cycle.
I think it's very big, resetting the cycle. Yeah, I feel like it's coming from the galactic core, or at least from, I was going to say Alcyon, but I think which is the star that we really revolve around. We're looking at the giant fractured sphere at the Vatican. For those of you that don't know what that is, that's a Dyson sphere. So if we've been wondering, do we have a second sun? Is there a sun simulator? Well, this is something that has been talked about by scientists that can not only harness the energy of the sun, but move a sun from one position to another. And it's just a higher level of technology. Isn't that curious that that's at the Vatican?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and for me, if the Anunnaki were as advanced as they say they were, and they needed gold to protect their planet, to build a Dyson sphere would make complete sense, and it would also mask them. We wouldn't be able to see them from where we're at. I also find it very, very interesting. I'm just throwing information here. You're going to have to dig. It's a thing that I can lead a horse to water, but if you don't want to drink, there's not much I can do about it. I find it interesting that over the last several maybe 8 or 10 years, people have noticed that funny little projection on the moon, including the lines rolling across it like the old TVs used to. It makes you wonder what they're masking up there. I've seen enough images that from reliable sources, let's say it that way, that I'm getting to question what's actually sitting up there above our heads. Then when you start thinking about, people, David Icke and other ones, the Zulu, even my own people here in the United States, the tribes here, you have to look at that moon as something that may not be exactly what you been told it was. Back to that snake tongue on the NASA logo again. Here's the thing. If things keep doing the same thing over and over again, and the cycle keeps getting shorter and shorter, then that tells you that we got to be winding things up. It's to the point where it's so balanced now that they have to reset more quickly. And that's good for us. That means they don't get a stranglehold. There's enough of us now to balance it out, and they have to reset. And it's that old thing of time after time. And there are stories about time being reset or stopped. I don't know how that would work, but we're dealing with things that we can't even see because they're dimensionally not in the same space we are.
Right. Yeah, it's all very, very fascinating. So, there's so many people have done so much research on all this. When I No, it's not Pavlov. I'm trying to think of this. The scale of a civilization, Kardashev scale. Yeah. So, at a certain level, and not even at the highest level, you'd be able to create like this Dyson sphere and harness the power of the sun and move the entire solar system anywhere you want. Now, you were sharing, what was your observation tonight, Raven, that you came on and told me and Cindy?
Well, in 2007, there was an image that came through the SOHO satellite in infrared, and it showed this object coming in from the outside edge of the solar system. It came all the way across and lined up with the Earth, and it had like a parachute on it. It almost looked like it was a solar sail, except for it was going the wrong direction. And then all of a sudden, it expanded and it wrapped around the Earth. It pops up on YouTube every once in a while, and then all of a sudden it just disappeared again, so I screen captures. That was 2007. And I don't know about the folks in the chat room, but for me, I had a lot to do in 2007. I was with 2006, and I was sitting up on top of a mountain. And I noticed that stars weren't quite right. The sun wasn't quite right. And in 2007, a lot of things started changing, including the fact the Inuits themselves in 2007 were the first ones to say the sun wasn't sitting in the right place.
Yeah, and I mean, I've noticed strange oddities with the moving of the position of things, and what I swear was east, it turned out to be like southeast or even almost south-southeast. And, you got to wonder if the ability is there to actually move the star that we orbit around, then that changes everything. And, maybe... Go ahead.
We have so many different things going on at once. It's Jupiter moving and being binary. There are so many things that are being observed that don't make any sense based on science information that we've been given. It creates cognitive dissonance even in me, and I'm very, very open-minded. But when I start seeing things that just don't fit, I have to say, no, wait a second. I told you tonight, I sit down here on the porch, and I looked up in the sky, and the Big Dipper is pointing northeast. And I have mountains for reference, so I know Big Dipper should not be pointing where it's at. It's pointing northeast, not north.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But like as you had shared before, which maybe we could just retouch it briefly because it's fascinating to think of. Yeah, the Cherokees say that the sun we have now wasn't the original sun.
Yeah, and there's other tribes too that say the same thing. The yellow sun and Jupiter were brought in or came in and displaced Saturn and Venus. And in the midst of that, one planet got destroyed. The war spread out, and the planet that we were on was burned in some way, and we had to come here. Back to the 7 silver canoes. The Zulu said they came on 7 silver shields. The Aboriginal said they came through the dream time on 7 silver threads or 7 silver strands. The Laplanders said 7 silver sleds. Once if you look at the cultures, that's what they use. So that's the reason why the terminology is. But I find it interesting that they all came from a reddish planet to here after a disaster, and they all came on 7 somethings. To me, I've always thought 7, starships or 7 somethings that got us from one place to another. But the war had already started at that point.
Yeah, every culture has a legend of these wars, between good and evil. It's just that simple, and it's the same thing in the Vedic tradition. And obviously, if we look at some of the roots, more of the roots where our modern Judeo-Christian comes from, you could look over to Persia, because that changed the whole philosophy when they were in the exile over there. Everything changed, and they started to get that messianic idea and adapt more of a good versus evil, light versus dark dichotomy. And
by the time Persia came along, even in Scripture, it names the Wraith. They call it Ashka Nasa. You can look that up in the text. I don't know if that's in the Apocrypha or in the regular Scripture, and my brain is not going there tonight. But they did. They called it Ashka Nasa, which I find very interesting because the ones who have taken control through the powers that be, or should be, the name Ashkenazi. And I should have said that out loud, but I did anyway.
Yep. Yeah, and those that follow Benjamin Fulford and a lot of other sources talk about all this. And I just have up real quick the Kardashev scale. So a type 1 civilization is a planetary civilization that can use and store all the energy available on its planet. And modern scientists put us at like a 0.73. We're not even a type 1 yet. Type 2 is a stellar civilization, and they could use and control the energy, including moving the stellar system, the sun, the planets of their own. And then you get to a galactic civilization, which can actually harness the energy and move things at will in a galaxy. And it doesn't even stop there. That was the initial 3, but then it was amended. And then we get into being able to control the properties of physicality at will. And I have shared with you guys, I've seen a being dematerialize in front of me after feeling something get pushed into my belly energetically, and waking up and seeing about an 8 to 9 foot tall gray alien with 3 long fingers. And as soon as it saw me, it looked away, and it was like it was meditating. And it took it, I think, about a minute and a half before it faded out of sight. It was almost like getting beamed up, like beam me up, Scotty. It was like very physical, and then slowly it started to get fuzzy, like the fuzz on a TV screen when there's no picture, and then disappeared.
Well, before everybody gets thinking that I'm way too out of bounds talking about Dyson spheres and the Kardashev scale, if there's a Dyson sphere, what you're going to do is you're going to get infrared signature, not light, infrared, because they're going to have this Dyson sphere around the sun, and what you're going to see is the heat that they're trying to dissipate. You're not going to see the sunlight. Now think about how many red dwarfs that are only infrared that we've found over the last, say, 7 or 8, 10 years. It's interesting, whole spaces that they're looking at now that are primarily occupied by red dwarfs that are moving in very, very strange ways. They're infrared signatures. I also want to point out that the powers that should not be spent billions building infrared telescopes in Antarctica, in New Zealand, in the United States. Why would you build something that expensive if you weren't looking for something in the infrared?
Yeah, it's all very interesting. I've had a lot of discussions with David Dubine about all the stars that are going and getting turned to red giants, and the thought is there's this galactic superwave that's rolling through and affecting stars and changing the stars. I wonder if it's a galactic parasitic wave. Yeah.
Well, it could be a wave of change too, which would not hurt us in the least. The problem we have is we have a very tangled web. The length, just in the last 20 years, look at the language that has changed. Look at the reinterpretation books. They have completely tried to erase history over the last 20 years and rewrite it right in front of our eyes. So how hard would it be? They're already successfully rewriting history with us still around to contest it. Mm-hmm. So the reset is, everybody said, they couldn't do that. Well, it wouldn't take much. We've got a disease that's going around the world right now. And if it's going after everybody who's older and has been beat up and actually lived their life, the younger people would have no idea what the older people knew.
Well, that could be why our lifespan's limited too. And I've always thought that.
Yeah, it would allow the reset to happen actually quite easily. And then I talked about the orphan trains in the 1800s. There were very few adults anywhere, but there were a lot of kids. And they used them to do the cleanup. And they spent the 1800s and 1900s blowing up all the remnant buildings. It doesn't take much to dig. It's a big rabbit hole, and you have to do a lot of digging. But there's just too many inconsistencies, even in recent history. Then when you start going back and looking at the dates, why is it that the Hebrew calendar is only 5,700 years?
And the thing that I find interesting too is the Kali Yuga begins very shortly after the Hebrew calendar begins. So we go to the Dark Age, right away. Now going back here, I just wanted to make the statement about that being that was over me. It felt clinical. It didn't feel evil, and I've felt evil beings. It didn't feel lovey-dovey and warm and fuzzy. It felt clinical. It felt like it was just like a nurse that would come in and take your vitals. If you were in the hospital, they just wanted to check your stats. That's what I felt. That's exactly what it felt like.
Are you running a fever? Uh-oh.
Yeah, right?
That was soon. I hope some people laughed. My thing is like, if we can astral project, and we can get in between planes, which is what astral projection does. And sometimes you can astral project and other people physically can see you. If we can do that in these bodies with the limitations that we have, why should something else not be able to do the same thing?
Right.
And I hope that I tried to be a little bit more history and show the span of time. And I hope that helps, the folks in the chat and listening to us understand that we're talking about a huge difference in time between the Annunaki and this take by the Archons, the Reptilians, both in our physical presence and beyond, and these Wraiths that people, properly call demons because they do demonic things. There's a huge difference between screwed people we're talking about.
Yeah, and so, I've seen some dark energies several times. Once when my son was 8 years old, he was being in trouble by horrible nightmares, so he came and he slept with me, and I just woke up in the middle of the night, and there was this dark thing over him that looked like a black hole with red glowing eyes, and I got pissed, and I went to punch it, and, it hissed at me, and I said, "Get the bleep out of here," and it just took right off. Now that thing felt pure evil. But at the same time, it left immediately as soon as I went to, swipe at it. And so, whenever I see anything that's darkish, I tend to swipe at it and tell it to get the bleep out of here. And they usually do. They really will. They'll leave.
The strangest one I ever had was years and years ago. With being I'd make dream catchers for kids that are troubled. or for people that are having trouble and just can't quit. I do the old-fashioned thing. I use a vine, and I don't look any fancy purple and ones. I find the feathers that should be used, and I had a young girl. She might have been 13 or 14 years old, and she just being harassed, and she said it felt like she was being molested. But she'd wake up and she's afraid, and I'm like, well, okay. So I sat at the house one night, and I heard, and I ran into her room, and I looked out the window, and I saw this thing at me. I have no idea how to describe it other than a wraith. It was formless, but it was shadowed, but it wasn't shadowed. I couldn't tell you what it was. It saw me, and I literally caught the inside window, one of them double-hung windows. The window shot across the room at me. I caught it and set it down on the floor, and as soon as I turned, that thing tried to hit me in the solar plexus. And, you're talking about that thing reaching in from behind. This one tried to hit me from the front, and I saw it coming. And it just stopped dead center in front of me and looked at me and fled. I knew what it was. I knew what it was doing. I knew it was coming for me, but it physically threw that window across the room at me. So, a demon, agree in this case, you can call that one a demon. But I know a lot of people that have encountered these things.
Yeah, I've encountered them. I'd say 3 or 4 times. 3 times I've encountered them, and they do leave. They don't feel nice. Now I've had interactions what I feel are nature spirits, which have been absolutely wonderful, especially when I was working on my garden, and be meditating in my garden after working on it at sunset, and I could actually hear like little footsteps, and I'd like open my eyes and nothing would be there. There might be a little twinkle, a little bit of a light flash here and there, and Cindy and I see that all the time. We do all the time what we take to be elemental beings. Yeah. Right, Cindy?
We do. We see these and I have a theory. I think I know what's going on, but we've been seeing them a lot lately. And I got a little bit of a transmission, which was curious. So I'm just sort of sitting and watching that. But ultimately, like with these reptilians and these wraiths and stuff, do they all have their own individual agenda? I mean, what are we just got stuck on this planet together? I mean, what happened?
Well, my understanding of it is that the Annunaki were at war, and there were other beings involved in this war. And somehow the Reptilians ended up here later after the planet had been destroyed. So that'll tell you about timeline-wise with the Native American stories. Mm-hmm. But the Wraith would have been here beforehand, I'm sure, because if you go back to the Atlantis stories, that puts it back to the first big cataclysm, 25,000, 50,000 years ago. That would have been long before, or just after, I guess, the Anunnaki left. I think they were coming in to fill in a void, and since they were stuck here, and this place had been sealed off because of what they had let loose, according to Thoth, they couldn't get back out. So we're kind of like stuck. And the enemy of my enemy is your friend. So the Reptilians that had no good interest for us made a barter with the same lion entity that's lied to everybody else all this time. And they got just stuck and just as mired as everybody else.
I see. And it looks like, hold on, are we still online? Can you guys still hear us? We lost on the big screen. I'm not sure what happened.
Yeah, it cut dead here.
Okay, so Mark says, yeah, you can. Okay, so everybody can still hear us.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, we're back, guys.
Ooh, yeah, scary.
Sorry about that, Raven. So
isn't it funny that we start talking about something serious and we get cut off? The other night, my phone just shut off.
Yeah, it is. It's really strange that those things just keep happening when we touch on something, Well,
it's if you go back to the traditional stories from around the world, we have good reptilians and bad. We have good humans and bad. And the differentiation is whether or not they've been working for the same goal, toward that same goal that we started all those years ago.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting, and yeah, that's what I was looking into. I've been doing research on and off, trying to compare our legends of Draco to Nagas, for instance, and then the Chinese benevolent dragons, as
Yes.
so it's interesting stuff to
Well,
look at.
here we call them Uktani, the dragons. Um, they were a little bit different. Ours were the big kind of dragons, not the more humanoid type of dragons. But there's some old pottery that you can find that actually shows a reptilian-shaped humanoid sitting on the back of a dragon. Doesn't that sound like the Chinese?
Yeah, that's cool. I'd love to see a picture of that.
I'll have to see if I can get down to the museum and get a photograph. Yeah, I don't know if handle that, but we'll see what we can do. But there's other stories, and there's a rock carving. There's a rock carving that I'd seen from down in, I think, don't hold me to this, y'all, but I believe it's Venezuela, down there in the ruins. That's very, very similar to, shows a reptilian type shape. They tried to date it back just like 300 or 400 years before the Spanish arrived, but it looks just as old as a petroglyph here in the United States.
Yeah, there's so much as far as that, and I've done so many shows showing all around the globe, every culture. You have that.
It's fun to take the similarities and say, okay, now, why do all these people have all these similar stories? And why do they have all these similar tales and understandings? And then you've got this one group that came out of North Africa and expanded and changed and took different names in different societies and different empires, and they tell a completely opposite story as everybody else. That should make you wonder.
Yep. Yeah, and like Larry's bringing up the stones over in Peru. I did a video on that too, and it just Peru's great. I mean, I'd love to make it down there sometime. It's on the bucket list.
For everybody that's in the chat that hasn't already done so, you mentioned the Englishman, Graham Hancock.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic source of information. I would say Eric von Doniket, very, very good source of information, but think of him as terrestrial, not extraterrestrial. I met Eric long 20 years ago, and he's a fantastic mind, brilliant man, but he won't let go of the fact they were here. They didn't just come here and leave. They were here and still are, which is another point that I wanted to bring up. If we've got Annunaki and Reptilians that were traveling from planet to planet, does anybody in the chat room think they gave up that technology? You wonder why these things are flying around and you're seeing all these strange ships and these strange shadows in the sky and so forth and so on? Do you think that they would have given up the technology? No. Look at all the ships that are flying. Every time you turn around, people are catching images of things flying up the moon. Now, it's up there that these things are flying to and from.
Yeah, exactly. And you are cutting in and out a little, but you are cutting in.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. We can hear you for the most part.
I'm up in the mountains, y'all, and this closest cell phone tower to me is like way out of my vision, thank goodness. But you think about this. If you all in the chat room had a spaceship and you could go from planet to planet and you could come down and check on your little pets every once in a while and maybe interrupt the good guys or interrupt the bad guys at will, would you give up the technology that allowed you to do it? Heck no. Heck no, you wouldn't. It didn't say the Anunnaki left. It said they left this planet and went back to their home planet. And if you look at what the queen of the Anunnaki lived, they said it was Jupiter. So that's interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, Europa is interesting, and there's
exactly.
There's so many interesting moons, and there's more moons being discovered all the time.
All the
I mean,
time.
maybe they're actually ships coming and parking.
I'm going to give them snake-tongue people another lashing. Why is it that they give us all these images from 10 million light years away, and they have to give us CGI and artist renderings and painted over images of our planets.
Right.
That don't quite fit with the story now, does it?
No, and if something doesn't make sense, it's usually not true.
You know, I agree there. I agree there 100%.
Yeah.
I would tell folks, you know, I can't remember the guy's name, and I wish I could because I really something sees all. I wish I could remember his name. I'd like to give him credit, but he's the one that caught that wave going across the moon. And recently we've been seeing those waves going across the sky. It does make you wonder. I don't know what we're looking at sometimes. I go outside and I look at the stars, and I go back inside. I'm like, that's not my sky. I'm going to call it quits for the night.
So yeah, it's all very interesting, and people are talking up about people going inside, and then we have the whole inner Earth, Shambhala, Shangri-La, Agartha, you know, and there's that
and
too.
Admiral Byrd himself.
Yeah.
And the Nazis, you know, I hate to bring them up, but, you know, they said that they had found a gate that went under the ice to another place. How true that is or how true it isn't, they sure tried to bury it.
Exactly. Yeah, and, you know, like Rue's talking about the pictures on Mars, but it's interesting, too, because every so often in some of those Mars ones, you see something that looks so anomalous, it's just like, you know, that's not natural.
Right.
You know, nature doesn't make things like that, you know, particular shape. So.
Well, and, you know, it's just our history and our vision has been clouded so much by the people in control that we have to wade through just to get tiny pieces. You know, after 30 or 40 years, you get an idea, but I'm the first one to tell you that next week I could find something, or somebody else could find something that would completely change my mind.
Sure.
You know, that's where beliefs get you into trouble. You can believe anything, but there's a lie in the middle of that. So you have to look at things without having a preset agenda for what you're going to find.
Yeah.
I love to find things that confirm what I'm thinking, but unfortunately, over the years, I found out that I find a lot more that dissuades me.
Then you have to reanalyze. But, you know, if you're open-minded, you could do that. If you're closed-minded just with one particular set of beliefs, that's especially when it's out of fear, because, you know, so much of it's fear of punishment. You know, if you grew up Catholic in the old days, it's all fear of punishment. My dad still, he had told me about getting whacked on the head with a ruler, whacked on the knuckles with a ruler, and it's all hellfire and damnation. You're going to go, you know, burn forever in the lake of fire. And so, you know, that's what was keeping people in line, keeping people not questioning anything, just eyes forward. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Absolutely. You know, and here's my thing. If they have to manipulate you with fear, whether it's fear of death or fear of punishment or fear of a God that loves you, there's something wrong with that whole message. I would much rather do things because I'm loved than because I have to be fearful if I don't.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, you know, even when it comes to people you want to look up to and respect, you know, instead of a boss that I would fear, I'd much rather want to do something for that boss because I trusted and loved and respected him.
Yeah. You know, and the thing I want to point out to the chat room is years ago, I had an aneurysm and it crippled me for almost a year. Right before the aneurysm hit, I was invited to the International Conference on Atlantis. So I'm not just talking out my backside. I was a respected researcher at the time, and I was doing gratuity speeches and what have you. So on that part, you know, I would have been the odd man out at the conference because I was going by Plato and I was going by oral traditions from around the world. You know, and then the tablets of Thoth come out that confirm a lot of the oral traditions. These things that are manipulating haven't been here that long, folks. They want you to believe that they've been here forever, and the religions teach you that they've been here forever. And the truth of the matter is these things didn't get here until somewhere between 25 and 50,000 years ago, and they have been playing games with us politically and religiously ever since.
Yeah, and I think we've been tricked to give our power away. I think that's clear. It's the conditioning gives our power away, so we don't recognize our own abilities and what we can really achieve.
Well, the other thing that's lost in that is there's an old book called the Initiate. He goes to an elder, and the elder says, well, you have to make it. And it's okay, well, see if I can do it. And the elder says, well, you're going to have to do it to become, someone who understands the sacred wisdoms. Finally, he gets himself talked into it, and the elder says, well, now you're going to have to take this with you. He's like, what? He was unheard to travel with a woman that wasn't married to you at the time. And so the initiate does what he's told. He travels all the way across the mountains into another country that's completely foreign to him. He goes to the mountain there, and he makes his offering, and he comes back. Well, in the meantime, he's fell in love with the woman. They've decided to get married. And the elder looks at him, and he says, it's not the destination, it's the journey. And that's the thing that so many people miss out on. They're so fearful and anxious and worried, and, all the problems that are temporary that we 10 years later remember keep you from enjoying the journey.
And the other thing that hits me, like that is the truth. It's all about what we do while we're here and how we, interact with each other. And there's so much power if we could just shed this darkness. There's so many layers to things. So we were talking about reptilians. We were talking about Annunaki. We're talking about these truly, demonic entities. And then to head over to the light side, you have the stars and the planets themselves, which are actually conscious entities too.
Well, the story is that there is a river of life that flows out from the center of the galaxy. It goes through every star, and from every star it goes out to every planet. And when it comes to the planet, it goes through every person. So we're all connected to the center of the galaxy. And then the galaxies are connected by rivers as well. And that's the old story. Now, if you start looking at new science, they start talking about plasma and Brooklyn currents and all these toroidal fields that travel in and around the galaxies, the planets, and the solar systems. If that's not confirmation of the old legend, the old oral traditions, I don't know what is.
Right. Yeah, it's all very fascinating, but the key is really compassion and love and respect and honoring, and we haven't been really taught that so much in this society. It's paid lip service, but not really taught. You don't really see it in action. What we get.
Well, the religions say love. The politicians say be one people. But at the same time, they keep trying to divide and divide and divide and divide. Well, that's not love. That's not being one people. One people is everybody on the planet, not the guy that lives next door to you, not your own family. That's everybody. And, people who can't see that are the reason why we're in the shape that we're in.
Exactly. Well, Raven, we're going to cut this one here. I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us again. And again, everybody, this is Raven. He's a published author, and he has a PhD, and he is very well versed when it comes to religions, ancient history, philosophy, things along those lines.
Absolutely love having you on, Raven. You're just so much fun. You're just fun. I love these things.
I appreciate having a conversation that we can talk. Have a good night.
You too, brother. Take care. Thank you so
Raven.
much.
Bye.
So I want to thank everybody that came as well. And as always, we keep going deeper and deeper. Yeah, Chris says Philip K. Dick is awesome. There's so many different places to go for information. It's just, it's a wonderful tangled mess. And so I really think that really points us, again, to going within, because, we ourselves are like tremendous antenna. So if we are putting out a positive, loving vibration, we're going to draw beings to us that are positive and loving.
hence, that's why we have to remember, like, what we're putting out is what we're going to receive. Like Michael said, we are an antenna, we're a generator, and we are an absorber of that information that we send out. So, and plus, if you look at water, the things with water, if Emoto, Dr. Emoto.
Yes.
Super important. Like, he did these experiments where he would put the vibration of love on water, flash freeze it, and it would show up and make like a beautiful crystal. If our bodies are that much water, just think how important it is to think loving thoughts.
Absolutely. It's just so important. So thank you guys so much, as always, for your support on Ko-Fi and Patreon. And we keep going deeper and deeper in our search for the truth. And, open minds are always ready to reevaluate and look at some different evidence, which we're always getting more evidence out all the time now.
Always got to keep the mind open. Always.
Yes. God bless, my friends. Namaste.
Namaste.